Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Minor Rex. My name is Quinn, and today I'm joined by
Dana, Christa,
and Camryn.
And we're going to talk about some trends in modern fantasy and sci-fi. So to start us off, I'm going to hand it off to Christa, who manages our sci-fi fantasy collection, and just to give us the pulse of the publishing industry as far as fantasy is concerned.
Yeah, thank you. A lot of things are happening a lot of the time, to put it succinctly. There's been a definite big uptick in romantasy publications, kind of alongside that typical expectation of, you know, your standard hard sci-fi, space opera-esque style. I feel like we've been seeing, honestly, a lot of alternative histories coming up. Although that may just be the same, like, three authors continuing to kind of recur within my purchase suggestions. When I've been talking with patrons a lot lately, I've noticed kind of a change in how people will describe what they're looking for when they're talking to me about science fiction or fantasy. There's a lot more emphasis on, like, types of characters now, I've noticed, where people will say, I'm looking for books with, like, AI companions or with talking animal companions. I actually really enjoy that kind of description now, of going beyond, like, here's a trope or here's a broad genre and going to, like, I'm looking for this specific trait. So that's been fun to notice as I've been talking with people.
Have you noticed too, like, I feel like there's a rise in popular genres that have, like, that found family element.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And so I feel like a lot of times, like, now in society, there's, like, everyone's longing for community, right? With, like, the kind of silo of technology that we're all living in. So sci-fi and fantasy are coming up with this found family, and, like, you just really get these, like, endearing characters.
Yeah, I think Becky Chambers,
Yes.
when I think of found family sci-fi. And also I think a byproduct of that is the rise of cozy fantasy.
Yes, for sure.
It's a pretty big subgenre right now. And that kind of ties into the found family archetype.
Oh,
Yeah. I've been really happy with the rise of cozy fantasy. I feel like there's been a sprinkle of cozy science fiction because I feel like for a lot of people, the genres still have that association of, like, here's your 600-page tome with world building that you have to, like, search for meaning, which in some cases is true. In a lot of cases, it's not. But I think kind of pivoting towards that cozy environmental feeling, it's made the genres feel a little bit more accessible to more people, because then they're like, okay, I can just think about this little subsect of the world and the dynamics between this set of characters, as opposed to having to think about, like, what are the geopolitical implications of this one character's monologue on page 37, you know?
Yeah.
I think, too, along with that, the Murderbot series, like with Martha Wells, I feel like it made it very approachable because they started out as, like, you know, very short novellas, and it was just kind of like a one bite, cool, oh, that was great. And I was really surprised to see Apple, like, take it and make, like, a TV adaptation. And everyone that I know who, so far that I've talked to, I'm waiting for someone to not like it, but, like, everyone I know who, like, loves the series is just like, oh my gosh, and Apple did so great. And, like, what's so strange about that is, like, Apple did change the story a little bit
they did?
in the towards, like, the end. Not, like, too much. It was a long span between when I read the first book and watched the thing, but I was like, wait, I don't remember this part. I feel like that's in a different one. But to have them be able to do that, and then so many, like, diehard fans still be like, oh, but it's so great, I can't wait for season 2, you know, like, and it goes along with that, like, AI companion.
I feel like a lot of the things I've been ordering right now tend to be a toss-up between, like, this is my robot companion who's helping me save the world, and I'm someone who's been trapped in this tech facility that I have to fight my way out against the corporation AI. So I feel like it's been going kind of either way, especially just as, like, generative AI has been more integrated in society. We're definitely seeing that reflected in a lot of the things that are coming out right now.
Yeah. It's interesting that being, I just finished The Expanse, which is a lot of people's like favorite sci-fi series, and it is one of my favorite sci-fi series. But that one was interesting because I was reading it and I kept having the thought of there's no real like thinking machines in this. It's a lot of human element. There is a the found family element of it is really prevalent and significant throughout the entire book. But yeah, the AI as like a issue is not really tackled there, and I think that's a byproduct of the books being published before AI really became so prevalent in modern day use. I finished that the other day, and I was like, yeah, they didn't really touch on the whole thinking computer thing. All of the spaceships are still driven by humans. There's like a complex calculation going on behind a computer or whatever, but there's not really like a thinking machine with a personality. I found that interesting.
That's quite an achievement to read that series. I love the TV series, but the book series intimidates me so much.
It's so good. The way it's written makes it flow really well, and I know most of us have read Dungeon Crawler Carl, if not all of us, or have at least started Dungeon Crawler Carl. And it's written in that same way where it's like 10-page chapters and constant.
Okay.
Yeah, Carl doesn't really switch perspective, but it's constant like perspective change, and each book has a different set of perspectives. So that makes it really sort of like palatable, piecemeal. You can read 2 chapters and know it's going to take you like 25, 30 minutes to do that, and that's really nice. I love The Expanse. I could talk about it forever, so I don't want to monopolize, but it's really great. It's really, really great. And the TV show I haven't seen, but I've heard is also very good.
So good.
Yeah.
Yeah, we were talking a little bit just like the notion of adaptations overall with book to TV or book to film, but also like text novel to graphic novel.
Yeah.
We touched on that earlier.
Yeah, I've actually noticed that a lot. I'm the selector for graphic novels, and there's definitely been an uptick both in terms of the like fantasy adaptations. So you have like Dungeon Crawler Carl is actually getting a physical printing of the web novel webtoon, so they're physically printing that. Under the Oak Tree has a 3-volume graphic novel series that just recently finished. And not only that, but you also have like these science fiction epics. They took the first Dune and it's separated into 3 separate graphic novels. And I think it's just something that has been happening more as there's this growing interest in science fiction and fantasy and people wanting in almost easier way to get into it. You can read the graphic novel adaptation, get kind of a feel for what it's like in a way that feels less intimidating than going into, especially in the case of Dune, this huge book. So,
Are there any in particular that you would recommend?
I'm not sure. I've heard good things about, the Under the Oak Tree. I've been reading a lot more webtoons and like webcomics recently that are getting physically printed, or adaptations of classic novels. Not so much the science fiction fantasy side, because I enjoy reading the novels themselves, and a lot of times I'm in the middle of reading the novel. So, yeah.
I know a lot of people like to listen to an audiobook and then read along with the text. Do you think the best comparison I can think of is like adult picture book or like adult illustrated book? Do you think there's going to be a lot of people who want to have like the text copy and then the graphic novel kind of side by side to help visualize?
Maybe. I think it depends on how faithful an adaptation is to the text, because a lot of times you're dealing with less room to include things. So you might have to deal with like, there's an adaptation of The Hobbit, a graphic novel adaptation, and chances are they had to take a bunch of stuff out of it to fit the amount of pages that they had for the adaptation.
Yeah, the one I always think of when I think of graphic novel adaptations is Kindred, which I thought was a really interesting choice to adapt. I haven't read the novel, but I've read most of the graphic novel. I think it's a heavy subject matter, so I picked it up for an afternoon, and I was like, oh boy. But yeah, I was like, okay, that's curious. Yeah, because Dune makes sense to me because it's such like but Kindred, it feels so grounded that was kind of but the art style's gorgeous for that. Yeah.
Yeah, well, and I found too, it's really useful for people who have like stuff that they wanted to read. Like, maybe you've really meant to read Dune, but you're very intimidated by just the sheer size of it, or even, you want something that's a little more approachable at first to get a feel for whether the actual content of the story is something you'd even be interested in. Because you can read a graphic novel for a half hour and get significantly farther in it than you would a text novel. That's just the nature of the beast, in my opinion. So I think it's really useful for stuff like that, too.
I'm wondering, too, I'm kind of going to go off track and then come back on the track. So with Dungeon Crawler Carl coming out as a graphic novel, I'm just surprised. I mean, I'm sure as many people are, of the boom in popularity. I was in a Walmart in Peoria, Illinois, and I was just walking by the book section, and someone was with their partner or something, was like, "Oh, I really have heard a lot about this, da 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 da." And I just walked up to them. I was like, "That is an amazing series," and he was like, "Oh, but which one is the first one? I want to buy it." And I was like, "Oh, right here." And then I saw him later with the book in his hands. So I'm wondering one, what causes boom? And then two, how much is it going to boom too once the graphic novel comes out as well?
Yeah. They're also coming out with tabletop RPG supplement book and a type of board game if you're into niche board gaming where it's 1 or 2 player. You're doing a dungeon crawl, kind of like how Munchkin plays, is my understanding, in a very broad sense. But so you're knocking on a door and flipping over. There's an enemy, and you have stats that you can use. So you can do that 1 or 2 player. There's a backer kit up for it right now. But yeah, it's really exploding. I heard about it.
Well, and then you also weren't there film rights?
Yeah, film rights is sold.
Too?
Yeah, so to kind of explain what Dungeon, I don't think anybody has done this, and someone might be a little lost listening to it. It's a novel, and it is the sort of man versus AI concept to it. And, I don't want to spoil anything. But there is an AI that is involved, and it's about a man lives on Earth, which gets repossessed by aliens, and then they turn Earth into a competition show where you have to make it to the 18th floor of this dungeon. It's like a D&D dungeon or a fantasy dungeon. So it is a mix of sci-fi and fantasy where all of his powers and abilities come from this sci-fi technology, but it's, sufficiently advanced technology. Is indistinguishable from magic type deal, so he can shoot fireballs and all that. And then his cat, Donut, who's a talking cat, who's a regular cat that gains the ability to talk inside of the dungeon. And so it's about them and their, traversal and the friends that they make and the enemies that they fight and all that. It started as a self-published, forum-posted, almost a fanfic. It was posted on a board with a lot of fan fiction already there, but it was an original idea, and then self-published from there in ebook form. And then the audiobook had a lot of production value to it, so that's how I first heard of it, because the audiobook was pretty lauded when it came out. And then now it's got physical print, and it's one of the first books, I think, or I might be blowing smoke right now, but to my knowledge, one of the first books that has seen this much success out of a self-pub territory since maybe Twilight, I guess, if you count that as but that was still had industry backing to it, and this is really a lot of it's mostly indie stuff, especially from the initial publication in ebook format. But yeah, it's really blown up in the last 6 months, I would say. Yeah.
And the audiobook is amazing.
Yeah,
it's probably the best audiobook I've ever listened to.
Yeah, I've been meaning actually to, even though I've read most of this series up to this point, I'm trying to get my partner into it, and I'm really thinking about getting the audiobook so we can listen to it in the car together, because they also want to get into it, but they're not a huge reader.
Oh, yeah.
And so I was like, hey, this is really good for getting back into reading. It's very approachable because it's really fun.
I feel like it was a mix of, I'm sure tons of books, but initially it was Ready Player One meets the Hunger Games, meets a little bit of Hitchhiker's Guide. And there were 2 other books too, but I can't think of them now. And I was like, oh, this is a nice kind of fun balance of all these different stories into one, but it still feels like such an original idea.
And I feel like there's actually been, I mean, you could also probably speak to this, whether I'm completely
Go for it.
incorrect or not, in that I feel like there's been a lot more blending of science fiction and fantasy together. I have to, not chill, but I have to talk for a bit about one that I've read recently that's done this is apparently Sir Camryn Needs to Die by Greer Stothers. That is a larger portion kind of the novel is this shift from being just straight fantasy to this weird kind of blend of sci-fi fantasy. And I thought it was really well done. Some people were taken aback by the fact that this happened. But I feel like that, and also, Dungeon Crawler is indicative of this kind of shift in perception happening.
Yeah, I think definitely genre blending is becoming more common. So with Sir Camryn, I think that one's like a historical fantasy, some science elements.
It's more like pseudo-historical in that it's a made-up setting, but it's more kind of medieval-esque in nature. Yeah.
So, I mean, there's that route. We've touched a little bit on romantasy, so like romance fantasy. But another one I think is pretty big right now is the science fantasy, as we were discussing with Dungeon Crawler Carl, and also the famed Gideon the Ninth. I think I can safely say the books have been out for a couple of years now, so no spoilers, but I think we can safely say a lot of people are familiar with the fact that it exists as a series, and I think we're about 3 or 4 years into what has been dubbed the Electopause.
The Electopause.
Wait, what is the Electopause?
We've been waiting for the 4th book in the series, at least since I started working here.
It's been a while.
It's been several years. So as far as we know today, this is April 30th of 2026. Still no news on the Electopause. I don't know what day this is being published. So.
That's a notorious element of fantasy publishing is wait time between books. I think it's a byproduct of creating your own rules, and that lends itself to writing into a box a lot of times, where if you want to take the story in a way that maybe makes sense to you thematically, if you're writing in a fantasy world, that would probably entail breaking some rules. So you have to find a way to make your characters move in a world that doesn't exist, and that can be difficult.
For sure.
Yeah, I think George R. R. Martin.
Another famous example.
Patrick Rothfuss. For me, Scott Lynch, I really want to come out with the 4th Gentleman Bastards book, because those books are great. But yeah, and then I guess Gideon the Ninth. What is the premise of Gideon the Ninth? Because I understand that it exists, but I don't really know anything about it.
So the most popular publisher blurb associated with it is lesbian necromancers in space, which I think is what drew a lot of people into it, that description.
What drew me in.
Wow, I would have read it a lot faster if someone explained it like that to me.
But essentially, you can kind of think of it as this hard science fantasy where it's a lot closer to being that heavier world building. You do have to do a little bit more digging thematically. The setting is technically the 9 different planets within the solar system, but in classic science fiction approach, they have been renamed to the 9 houses of the Emperor Undying. Necromancy exists, and each house or each planet specializes in a different technique of applying necromancy. And our main character is Gideon, who is an indentured servant forced to become essentially a knight to a character who is, to an extent, her foil for at least a good portion of the series. So we are following them on their journey to ascend to sainthood, essentially, and also to master necromancy. And a lot of things happen that are very gruesome and very funny. So, yeah.
And while it's very science fiction based, I feel like the writing sets it up that you feel like it's a fantasy. Like it's got that very like world building.
Yeah.
Here are 25 million characters to learn their names, and
Everybody's name is Latin.
yes, everyone's name is Latin.
Well, and I think that part of that also comes from the author's background as like being very entrenched in fandom. Don't mean to call anybody out, but the author was very big in Homestuck and the Homestuck fandom,
really?
which I think explains a lot about
yeah.
the writing style and also kind of this very convoluted idea.
Yeah, I love finding out the previous careers or interests of fantasy authors because it's always applicable. Matt Dinneman showed cats. That's why Princess Donut is a show cat.
I didn't know
gosh.
that.
James S.A. Corey is the author for The Expanse, but it's actually two authors. It's a pseudonym, and one of them was a biologist or went to school for biology.
Oh,
so
that
when you
makes
read
so
The
much
Expanse,
sense.
yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Steve Erickson, who wrote Malazan, Book of the Fallen, was an anthropologist. Went to school for anthropology. So if you read those books are famously dense and filled with a lot of world detail. And it's clear that this is, coming from someone that has a lot of understanding of human history and culture. But yeah, that's always my favorite thing when you're like, oh yeah, that does make
Yeah,
sense.
well, I mean, that even goes back to like Tolkien's basis as a linguist. Like he started out as a linguist, and that's why you have the like super in-depth elven language, and all of that stuff is because that was just what he was interested in his day-to-day career.
Yeah, one of my favorite things to do when I'm doing like collection evaluation and maintenance is looking into the backgrounds of all of my authors. So I can tell you like the top handful of careers, a lot of people are doctors. A lot of people have had relation to like software and game design. Naturally, there's a category of people who are just like career authors, career writers, lawyers, and then historians and anthropologists, I think, are the most common ones that I've been seeing.
We've been talking about how, things in society kind of mirror what people's interests are in sci-fi. And The Expanse, I feel like, I don't know when the TV show started, but it's kind of older, right?
The first book came out, I want to say, around like 2009.
Okay, yeah.
And the series was written up until, I think the last book came out fairly recently. Within the last, I don't know, Christa, do you know when the last Expanse book came out?
Off the top of my head, I don't know a specific year, but I remember ordering it, so it has to have been within the last like 2.5 years.
Okay.
So.
Yeah, it was pretty, so it was written over 10, 15 years. Yeah, so times changed. But I think The Expanse deals a lot with class struggle.
Yeah.
So my guess is that the original inspiration for it was the 2008 financial crisis. Would make a lot of sense because it deals a lot with a hierarchical class structure and then land rights and like the value of the land that you're on and how that, shapes a person. And yeah, so it's like an economic sci-fi struggle, at least for the first. It's 9 books, and then there's a bunch of novellas as well. But the books can be structured as almost 3 trilogies. It reads like one long story. That's why the show ends after book 6. So the show only covers the first 6 books because there's like a pretty good ending to be had there at the end of the 6th book. But yeah, that would be my guess, is they saw the financial crisis happen, and one of the authors was George R. R. Martin's like protege assistant, like helped with editing or something, some of the books. So they were a career writer, and so they got a lot of tips from him about the political struggle, how to structure that. But it's a lot more local feeling than Game of Thrones
Yeah,
is.
for sure.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, because you're like, okay, there's no like, self-thinking computers or anything in that. It's very like bio sci-fi. But now I feel like there's all these articles like, okay, stem cell, like they've grown human brains and pairing them with computer chips. And then I read another one this week, all in 1 week, about how like they put like fungi in AI and like made it like a robot form and it would like move for how if they like shone light on it, how like fungus doesn't like light, so it would like move away from the light. I'm curious how that is gonna influence writing, because usually sci-fi comes before the future, and like just like economic classes, you know, that rings true through so much of history, if not all of history. You know, like people are like, oh, 1984, how did he know that? You know, so I'm just curious, like what is going to happen in the future of sci-fi writing when we're living in like a very sci-fi time, which also could be said for all of history, but or a lot of history.
I think it's really difficult to identify what exactly the moment is while you're currently living it. So a lot of the stuff we're going to see coming out of this era is going to feel like, oh, and they're going to have a television phone that you have in your living room and you can talk to anybody anywhere in the world. Like that kind of feeling to it without really understanding the implications of where things are going. So yeah, I'm interested to see. It's funny that Dune was written so long ago and has that as like, we don't even want to talk about thinking computers because I don't want to have to deal with that. It's such a complex topic. Frank Herbert was just like, yeah, they were bad and we got rid of them, and that's before the book even starts. Yep. Yeah, so it's going to be very interesting. I thought, it's not really sci-fi, but Eddington was a movie that came out somewhat recently that handled that topic pretty well as far as like what is the immediate repercussions of it. But yeah, speculative sci-fi is going to be, I think, have a lot of rich soil. It's changing so fast. I think people can't really, as soon as they get a hold of it, it's like, okay, how long does it take to write a book? And then by the time that's out, is it really as relevant as it could have been? I'm right now reading Red Rising for 20s and 30s Book Club, which if you're listening to this before May 20th, you should come stop by and read Red Rising. It's pretty fun. It's pretty good. And then listening to Brave New World at the same time. And it's interesting, the parallels between those books, because they're both based around caste systems is like a huge part of the world building. But Brave New World is lauded a lot as a, you know, pretty prescient sci-fi book. And I would say the trappings of the time are all over that book and are very problematic. But yeah, I think it is interesting. When it sticks, and it's usually a broad, like a very, very broad, like maybe something like this will exist, but it's not, you know, necessarily AI. It's like in Brave New World, it's Soma, like a risk-free drug that just lets you kind of check out of your problems, and that is an allegory now. You could apply it to social media, you know, and obviously social media didn't exist when Aldous Huxley wrote
I feel like that's also prevalent in a lot of stuff done by like Ray Bradbury. You know, you have all of this stuff in Fahrenheit 451 with the like TV
talking
walls and stuff like that. But also when you look into like, I think it's the Velt is the one where it's the house that manages the aspects of this family's like whole lives, to the point where the children don't see their parents as their parents. They see the house as their parents because the house is who is taking care of all of their needs, which is very prevalent in the, you know, kind of advancement of like smart homes and, you know, oh, I'm not having to think about all of this stuff in my house because it's all automated. So,
we mentioned Red Rising, and having read that previously, I wouldn't necessarily say it's like a topic that's coming up right now. It's one that's naturally existed for a while, but like anti-capitalist and anti-colonialist sci-fi speculative fiction. I think I've been kind of in like a social media feedback loop where I'm just getting a lot of content that's like, this book is the most anti-capitalist, this is the height of anti-capitalist, anti-colonialist literature. And I'm like, okay, I don't think they all can be, you know, within reason. But I feel like Red Rising was one that I kept seeing come up a lot. It's also kind of going through a bit of a popularity boom right now. I feel like there's another one recently that I kept getting, Blood Over Brighthaven by M.L. Wong. I was getting so much content about that, specifically being like anti-capitalist and anti-colonialist, but also like exploring like how women fit into that power structure as well, when they're not like at the height of the power structure, but also aren't a member of the marginalized community that's being colonized. So I thought that one was pretty interesting. That one was a good read.
And I feel like that's also something that's reflected in like sci-fi fantasy YA titles.
Oh,
Is I think also a lot of times stuff like that is reflected first in YA, and then if it's, I hate to use the term popular enough, but if there's enough interest in it as a YA topic, it kind of gets brought over into like adult and even like new adult titles. Like there's The Mermaid, the Witch, and the Sea, which is very like anti-colonial fantasy. There's probably other ones that I can't think of off the top of my head. Maybe Gear Breakers, which is more sci-fi mecha stuff, but also, you know, goes into the, you know, anti-militaristic and, you know, anti-capitalist kind of idea that was put in a couple years ago in YA and has kind of trickled over into adult spaces now.
I feel like we do see a pretty good amount of authors who transition from writing teen or YA fiction into adult fiction, because I feel like so many times when I'm reading book descriptions to purchase something, it's often someone's first debut, or it's always specified as adult debut. So they have an extensive history.
I mean, we were talking about Sarah J. Maas. I don't know if that was before we started recording.
It was before.
But, you know, originally starting with Throne of Glass in YA, and I think technically A Court of Thorns and Roses was considered YA when it was first released, and then over time got shifted over into adult science fiction fantasy. You know, so you see that a lot, even with books that have already been published, getting shifted over because of like whether it's the content included in it or just more kind of adult theming.
I'm wondering too, because like Sarah J. Maas started, I mean, she might have started before Throne of Glass, but Throne of Glass is where I came upon her. And then there was like, you know, this gap of time. So I'm wondering if the people who started, you know, reading Throne of Glass then grew up to be adult readers and they're like, oh yeah, Court of Thorns and Roses. But it did seem like I haven't read Court of Thorns and Roses or any of those.
That's the first one I read over.
But they do seem like more mature. But then there's also like Leigh Bardugo, who started with, you know, the Shadow and Bone series, and then went into like The Familiar.
I recently was reading a news article relating to Shadow and Bone and Six of Crows, that in some editions that are being published now, they actually no longer have the characters classified as teenagers.
Oh, really?
So there's been a bit of a controversy going on with like that, I don't know if I would say forced change in age of the characters, because I don't actually know if it was Leigh's decision or like a publisher decision. I don't know all the details on that, but like that decision to change the character's age, a lot of people were like, hey, so the books are kind of about that, like these teenagers are suffering the effects of the things going on around them. So like to change that detail does change the story and like the weight of the story.
I think Red Rising is an interesting case study in that phenomenon, because I heard from multiple people that it was written specifically as a YA to sell to a publisher, and then the future books, which I haven't read yet, are a little bit more mature. And then also you have the main character who is 16, but is like written in the book is like, well, my life has been so hard that I'm pretty much an adult already, and that also I have like a wife, and we're both 16, and and so. Yeah, I think that Red Rising is a really interesting sort of like, it is written as a book that you could read as, you know, why, but the subject matter in it, a lot of stuff is adult. Like there are very adult things going on throughout the entire book, but it reads like a YA book. The tone of it, the way that it's paced, it feels like a lot of tropes stacked on top of itself in a lot of places. But it's fun. Like it's a fun book. I would recommend it, but it's made me audibly chuckle a few times because of its YA tendencies, where I'm like, oh, this feels like it was ripped from like The Giver or like Hunger Games or something. We're making up nouns with two other nouns, and now it's like a whole different thing. It's a spin scythe, and the formatting is different. The middle word is capitalized. Yeah.
It's funny to jump from Red Rising or Six of Crows to Red Rising, because Quinn and I were just talking about this earlier. I went to BookCon in like 2014, which is, I believe, when Red Rising everywhere was advertising for Six of Crows and Red Rising. So it was kind of like, I feel like the height of YA at the time, because it was before TikTok, you know, like it was booktubers on YouTube.
Bookstagram,
yeah. So I think it's interesting to see the evolution of that.
Yeah. Speaking of another author who has recently kind of made that leap from YA to adult, Marie Lu had her adult debut, I want to say January or February, with The Red City. I read her previously for like Legend, Champion, so on and so forth. So if anybody has any particular nostalgic feelings about Marie Lu, she does have one adult release now and hopefully more to come.
Yeah, I remember when Legend came out, I
do too.
I was like 13 or 14. And I remember it was in a Scholastic Book Fair because I don't think we were having those anymore. But
So sad.
Yeah, well, we had them in elementary school. It was
Okay.
I was like either in middle school or high school when it came out. I think it was like I was in 8th grade. But I remember that being like a big thing. So that's interesting that she's...
No, I remember I was actually visiting family in like kind of rural area of Tennessee, and their library, which was literally a single room, had Legend. And I remember checking it out and reading it because I was like, oh, like I want to read something and I've heard good things about this. It was good. I did enjoy it, but I have very like specific memories of reading that book on their couch, you know, from this little one-room rural library in the middle of nowhere, Tennessee.
Yeah, I do think that it's an interesting and unique thing about sci-fi and fantasy is a lot of people, it's their entry point into reading as a hobby, and at least for me it definitely was. I think Percy Jackson was like the first series
big one.
that I
Percy
read.
Jackson.
And that was great. But yeah, I find that interesting because it is like as you become a more avid reader and as you like, I find myself looking for more challenging stuff as an adult than I did as like a kid or a teen or even like a young adult. But fantasy is still like a comfort zone because it is just like a pure escapist thing. And I think that's interesting whenever I'm like trying to get my niece right now. I think she's 5 and my brother's reading her Roald Dahl. And I'm like, oh yeah, I guess that is sort of like it's not necessarily sci-fi, but it's sci-fi adjacent. And they go into space and Charlie and the Great Glass Elevator and the BFG is a giant and all of that. So it's funny how that sticks with you and becomes, because it's my favorite genre still. It's the genre that I read the most. Yeah.
Yeah, and I feel like especially if you grow up on it, like my father actually is a very avid science fiction reader, and he has been like as long as I've been alive. So I also feel like there's that connection where like if you grew up surrounded by science fiction fantasy, as you get older, it's still a place of like, oh, this makes me feel safe. This makes me feel comfortable. You know, it's an escape. But still reflecting the issues that are currently happening.
Yeah. I come from kind of a similar perspective where it's something we grew up with, but more so from my older sister. And I was definitely the type of younger sibling who was like, I have to copy everything you're doing because you're so cool. So I remember like trying to force myself to read above my grade level because she would finish something and then just leave it on the shelf. And I'd be like, okay, my turn. Or she would want to like go to author signings. So my parents would take her and they'd be like, okay, I guess we have to take you too because we can't leave you home alone. So I guess credit to my sister for expanding my interest in reading.
That's funny because on the flip side of that, I remember, here I'm going to age myself, Big Fish, the movie, came out when I was in high school. And so I guess I would watch it a lot because, I don't know, just a few years ago, my brother, who's 7 years younger than me, was like, you know, I actually really got into Big Fish because you would watch it. And, you know, and I was like, oh my gosh, you don't even realize, like, you know, like that kind of effect. But I grew up watching like Star Trek Next Gen with my dad, and like any sci-fi movie that came out, we would go and see it together. So yeah, it's definitely a cozy. And now there is cozy.
Yeah, for me, it was definitely my 2 older brothers were both avid fantasy readers. I think my brother Damien is 6 years older than me, and he got into Brandon Sanderson in college. And so from there, I think started this sort of chain where he reads a thing and then goes like, oh, this is really good. And that was like 5 years from when I was in like middle of high school and he was in college. We'd kind of have that. So it's a nice thing for myself and my brothers when we read the same thing to have. It's sort of like a mini book club. Right now it's The Expanse. So me and Damien have both finished The Expanse and Kevin is in the middle of it. So it's always good to like check in and have that like, oh yeah, we're reading. Oh, did you read whatever, such and such? Malazan was another one that we all have read at least a little bit of. And then Wheel of Time was another one that we all had read. And so it's nice having that structure within, you know, the people that you can share this with. And it's such a niche thing. And when you say it out loud, you're like, oh, what you were describing, Gideon the Ninth is, yeah, it's like, oh yeah, that's Fantasy Mouth. That's like, oh, the Aes Sedai and the Terran Grial, like that kind of mush mouth talk.
Yeah. What my friends will do is, there's two of them in particular who like kind of fixate on their own series and they don't have very similar interests, but what they will do is they'll go, hey, I just read this series. If you read the first book of mine, I'll read the first book of yours.
Ooh.
And then they have very different opinions, so there will be a very loud FaceTime call a couple weeks after that where they're just like, arguing about what happened, what each scene meant, and then everybody else in the call is just kind of like, okay.
That's so fun.
Glad you guys did that. So that's also a fun option, I think. Just like comparing your individual experience of what you've read and what you interpreted from it.
Yeah, I think fantasy it's built on creating characters that the reader can project themselves onto. And you're always going to walk away with a different interpretation. At least a lot of times, a lot of like pop fantasy, especially literary fantasy or literary sci-fi gets away from that a bit. But I find that to be a pretty significant trope where we just have like Hero McGee and they're cool and nice and, you know, maybe they crack wise a little bit and you can be like, that's just like me. Yeah.
And I think that's especially like notable in stories that started as fan fiction and then were taken and metamorphosized into a more original work, but it still has that kind of intrinsic like fan fiction-y, like especially with like reader inserts. It's very interesting.
Yeah. Do we maybe want to talk about our like all-timer, like the best fantasy book or series, fantasy or sci-fi?
Oh, you're gonna have to let me think.
It's tough.
I don't really subscribe to having like a one all-time favorite. I think a lot of the time when I'm looking for like a science fiction or a fantasy that I enjoy, I usually like something that will make me laugh, though typically kind of from the point of like doing something you don't expect from the genre. Like if we're looking at Gideon the Ninth again, a lot of people love the humor in that, myself included, just because you're not always used to having a like female protagonist who is like making sex jokes, but then also still contributing to the plot. Like authors tend to kind of divide those behaviors a little bit. And I also just wasn't used to like seeing that sense of humor in that type of setting or type of plot line. So I was always like, this is really funny because it pushes at the boundaries of the genre or the conventions that were previously used. So that's usually what I'm enjoying.
I think more recently, you know, when you have like that book that everyone tells you, like, you have to read this book, you have to read this book. So it wasn't like as popular as like, I don't know, Theo of Golden or Remarkably Bright Creatures or anything like that. But a lot of people were telling me to read Light from Uncommon Stars by Rika Aoki. And I never knew the premise of it, but I was like, oh, I'm just not in the mood for like, just by the cover, I thought it was like a space sci-fi. And I love space sci-fi, but I just wasn't in the mood. But if anyone was to describe the plot to me, I'd be like, what are you talking about? 'Cause I have a little like tidbit here. So it's like, welcome to El Monte, California, home of Stargate Donuts, where current proprietor, an alien refugee, Lan Tan, lives with her children. So it goes from her point of view and then also the point of view of this violin teacher who is the queen of hell and has to get 7 violinists' souls in order to like get out of hell or else her soul is damned. And then there's another point of view from like this violin prodigy who's a trans character, and the Queen of Hell meets this prodigy and kind of like makes the Queen of Hell kind of like reflect on her past decisions and maybe her future too. And all of these characters' lives all intertwine, and it's just like so absurd, like some of the things that are happening, but it's written so well that it's just normal. And I feel like it's
the name of this
story.
again?
It's called Light from Uncommon Stars.
I might have to read
highly
this.
recommend it. It instantly like went to one of my favorite books of all time because it's just well written, and the way the lives intertwine is amazing. And then the ending is just like, oh yeah, because I kept being like, how are they going to end this? How are they going to end this? How do you? And it's done very well.
I would say for me, I really like long series because it gives you that sense of like lived in-ness and you get to know the characters well. I was always a series reader when I was a kid. So like Percy Jackson, Gregor the Overlander, and then Hunger Games by Susan Collins. So for me, the ones that stick around are the ones where I like, I spent 2 years reading that and I really got to know the characters really well, which is always interesting when it, time comes around if we're doing the newsletter or something where it's like, recommend something. And if it's a book, I'd like to recommend something probably recent or something that we're doing as part of a book discussion at the library. But it's always like I'm in the middle of a series that got started published in like 1993 and didn't finish until like 2015. So for me, though, like Wheel of Time was the book that I read throughout the pandemic, and that's 14 books. So that one really stuck with me because those were... There's a 3-book period called The Slog, which at least one of them is aptly named because nothing happens in it. It's 800 pages of switching perspective and characters reacting to the end of the previous book. But it's still, like I love it for that kind of monotony. And then The Expanse I talked about recently. I finished that. And if I'm like recommending something that it has like an emotional impact to somebody that's like looking to get into reading, I would recommend The Expanse because it's not a complicated book to read. It's probably like a 5th grade reading level if I had to guess in terms of like vocabulary, and it reads very quickly and it's just really action packed. The pacing is great. Each book follows a similar structure. So, you're like, I can feel I'm in the rising action and this is the climax and this is the resolution. And that series is great. Gentlemen Bastards is a trilogy that I've recommended a bunch, which is like, I described it as like Ocean's 11 in fantasy Venice, and all of the characters are like 20-somethings pulling heists on rich people. That's a really fun series. And then if I had to do like a literary pick, I think Slaughterhouse-Five is a sci-fi book that I come back to a bunch. I've probably read it 3 or 4 times, and I always read it in like one sitting because I think it's very poignant. It's very light in terms of sci-fi, but it's necessary to have that sci-fi element to get the point across that it's trying to. So that would probably be my whole group of probably like that's probably like 25 books altogether, 26 books altogether. But those are all really good books.
Yeah, for me, it kind of oscillates. Like I've kind of mentioned previously, I'm a big graphic novel manga reader, and something that keeps popping into my head is Delicious in Dungeon, which is very kind of classic fantasy. You've got your elves, you've got your orcs, you've got your dwarves, you have your public domain half-woods, which are hobbits, but with a different name. And it's like 14 volumes, and I remember my friend, one of my best friends, was really into it, and she kept trying to get me to read it because she knew I'd like it, and I just kept putting it off and putting it off. And then the anime started releasing, and I was like, oh, this is super good, and started reading the manga and have just gotten sucked into it because Ryoko Kui's like world building and setting building and the like magic system is so in depth and just like, I don't want to say mind blowing, but like you get sunk into it because you're like, oh, this is super interesting. It goes into dungeons and how there's different types of dungeons depending on whether it was elves who made it or whether it was gnomes who made it. And kind of in that same vein, you have Witch Hat Atelier, which has this incredibly in-depth magic system that gets kind of slowly uncovered throughout the course of the manga, which is still going, unlike Delicious in Dungeon, which is over. But in terms of like regular novel sci-fi, I definitely have that recency bias, which is I can't stop talking about apparently Sir Camryn needs to die. So I'd been following the author when they were in the process of writing it and then searching for an agent and searching for a publisher. So I've seen the entire process essentially of it being written. And there's a sequel on the way. It's been greenlit for a sequel. Yay. I'm excited about that. But yeah, I'd definitely say that that's one that I'm very into right now.
Yeah, with you bringing up Delicious in Dungeon, I feel like we have been seeing quite a bit of like cozy sci-fi, cozy fantasy that's like cooking centered. Interstellar Mega Chef came out, I want to say last year, and that one is like intergalactic cooking competition. I think a lot of us have seen all of the like cozy fantasy bakery. We used to
Legends and lattes.
Yeah, we used to be adventurers, and we actually really just want to like run a bakery and a tea house now. Or Baby Dragon Cafe just came out recently, or I can't recall if that's the book or the series, but it's very much like a good food as part of human nature and something that we can all kind of understand. I guess the human soul just longs for a sweet treat at the end of the day.
And like to go back to Witch Hat for a second, there's a spin-off for Witch Hat called the Witch Hat Atelier Kitchen that's literally cooking, which we have a lot of the copies here. And it's very funny and in the same vein as the manga itself. But you also experience that where you have these spin-offs that are more cozy oriented.
Yeah, I will add to my list now that we're talking about like manga and anime, which I'm not a big manga reader, but I do enjoy some anime and Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood.
Classic.
So good.
Was
Classic.
Yeah, that I would put up on my S tier.
Full Metal
Yes.
Alchemist. The mangaka has a new series out, Daemons of the Shadow Realm, which is getting an anime this season. Very much so in the same kind of vein as Full Metal Alchemist. Less alchemy and more like spirits type stuff. But if you are into Full Metal Alchemist, would heavily recommend.
Yes. We've been pretty big on Free Ren lately as well. Also, Trigun Stampede Stargate.
Yes.
So that's been fun lately to watch those. And like still looking at like human nature of curiosity and like we just want to explore and eat yummy things, and also, oh no, there's something trying to kill us that I think is a pretty common theme in so many science fiction and fantasy releases.
All right, I think we're probably at a natural ending point here. So we'll let you go, folks. Thanks for stopping by. This has been Minor Rex signing off again. My name is Quinn, here with
Dana.
Christa?
And Camryn.
Thank you so much for listening.